My name is Aurora Harris, and I am 28 years old. Last Christmas Eve, I sat at a long mahogany table inside my parents' Myers Park estate while my father attempted to extort $500,000 from me in front of 60 guests. The dining room smelled of roasted pine needles and expensive catered lamb. The ambient chatter of Charlotte high society filled the air until my father, Richard, tapped a silver spoon against his crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the room. Richard stood up, smoothing the lapels of his custom Italian suit. He looked down the length of the table, resting his gaze on me. He did not offer a holiday greeting. He delivered a financial demand disguised as a toast. To ensure the survival of your brother Julian and his groundbreaking tech venture, Richard announced, his voice carrying a practiced theatrical weight, "Our dear Aurora has agreed to step up. Tomorrow morning she will be signing over the $500,000 trust left to her by her late grandfather. It is a necessary sacrifice for the family legacy." The dining room fell dead silent. 60 pairs of eyes shifted toward me. To my left, my mother Vanessa took a slow sip of her Cabernet. She adjusted her pearl necklace, avoiding my gaze entirely, letting the crushing weight of public pressure do the dirty work. At the head of the table, my older brother Julian leaned back in his chair, shooting me a smug, entitled grin. They had orchestrated this entire ambush, hoping to weaponize my fear of causing a scene. They assumed I would shrink into my chair, terrified of embarrassing the wealthy Harris family in front of their country club peers. They expected me to nod, surrender my financial independence, and absorb the cost of Julian and his failing startup, just like they had forced me to absorb his mistakes since childhood. I felt my pulse slow down. As a corporate logistics auditor, I spend my days tracking missing inventory and hunting down supply chain fraud. I knew men like my father did not beg for money in public unless the alternative was prison or ruin. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice or throw my napkin. I simply picked up my water glass, looked my father dead in the eye, and offered a single word in response. Noted. I set the glass down on the pristine white tablecloth, stood up, and walked out of the dining room. I grabbed my coat from the foyer and walked out into the freezing North Carolina night. 12 hours later, my grandfather and his estate attorney would knock on my father's front door and deliver a legal revelation that would stop his heart. My parents thought they were bullying a quiet, compliant daughter out of a trust fund. They had no idea they had just walked into a fatal federal trap. Before I explain how I used their own greed to dismantle their empire and take their home, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe to Sister Revenge. Tell me your age and where you are listening from in the comments. I want to know who is tuning in today. Now, let me take you back to that freezing December night right after I walked out of the estate and the exact moment I realized my father was hiding a very dark secret. The cold leather of my steering wheel grounded me as I navigated my sedan away from the sweeping wrought iron gates of the Myers Park neighborhood. The heater blasted warm air against my freezing hands, but the chill of the dining room lingered in my bones. Driving through the affluent, tree-lined streets of Charlotte, I let my mind shift from the role of a disappointing daughter into the clinical mindset of a logistics auditor. In my profession, a missing pallet of inventory tells a story. You just have to follow the deficit. Tonight, my father had revealed a glaring deficit in his own pristine ledger. Richard Harris projected the image of a titan. He developed high-end commercial real estate wearing bespoke suits and commanding boardrooms with practiced intimidation. His reported net worth hovered in the double digits. Yet he had just humiliated himself and his family in front of 60 high society peers to extract a mere $500,000 from his youngest child. The math did not align. Wealthy men do not beg for pennies in public unless the bank is already knocking on the door. The missing variable was Julian. My older brother possessed a terrifying talent for burning through capital while wearing a designer smile. He launched cryptocurrency platforms and tech hardware startups that generated endless press releases but zero actual revenue. He leased exotic sports cars, lived in a luxury penthouse, and funded his lifestyle through unregulated shadow loans. My parents enabled this behavior for a decade, swooping in with their checkbooks whenever his creditors began circling. They viewed his flashy facade as a vital component of the Harris family brand. They viewed my quiet, steady career managing supply chains as a blue-collar disappointment. My grandfather Hal saw right through their charade. Hal was a self-made textile magnate who built his fortune with calloused hands and unyielding grit. He despised my father for turning the family name into a shallow country club currency. During his final months, Grandpa Hal drafted a highly specific trust. He bypassed Richard entirely, leaving $500,000 exclusively to me. He told me it was an impenetrable safety net designed to protect me when my father inevitably drove the family empire off a financial cliff. I pulled into the narrow driveway of my townhome and shifted the car into park. Before I could turn the ignition, my cell phone vibrated in the cup holder. The screen illuminated the dark cabin, displaying a text message from Mitchell Sterling. Mitchell was my grandfather's estate attorney, a veteran corporate litigator who operated with lethal precision and harbored a deep disdain for my father. The message contained 2 sentences. Your father just triggered the tripwire. I will be waiting at his estate at 8 in the morning. A sharp spike of adrenaline hit my chest. I did not know the exact mechanics of the legal trap Grandpa Hal had set, but I knew Mitchell Sterling never bluff. I walked inside, brewed a dark pot of coffee, and sat at my kitchen counter. I watched the clock tick toward dawn, feeling the tectonic plates of my family history preparing to shift. At exactly 7:55 the next morning, I parked my car on the cobblestone driveway of the Myers Park estate. The crisp December frost still clung to the manicured lawns. Mitchell Sterling stood waiting near the towering front pillars, holding a thick leather briefcase with brass latches. He wore a sharp charcoal topcoat and an expression of grim satisfaction. We did not exchange pleasantries. We walked up the bluestone steps together, and Mitchell pressed the illuminated doorbell. The heavy oak door swung open. Richard stood in the foyer wearing a monogrammed silk robe and holding a mug of premium espresso. The arrogant smirk he wore during his holiday ambush vanished the instant he registered the presence of the ruthless litigator standing beside his estranged daughter. What is the meaning of this? Richard demanded, pitching his voice low to hide his sudden uncertainty. Aurora, you caused quite a scene last night. Coming back here with a lawyer will not fix your behavior. Mitchell did not cross the threshold. He remained on the welcome mat, anchoring his stance. He unclasped his briefcase and pulled out a single, heavy document bearing the unmistakable embossed seal of my grandfather's master estate. Do you have any earthly idea what you demanded from your daughter last night in front of 60 witnesses? Mitchell asked, his tone ringing with cold corporate authority. I asked her to do the right thing for her brother, Richard countered, gripping the door frame. I am the head of this family. I determine how our assets are distributed. Hal is gone. Hal anticipated your greed, Mitchell replied, stepping closer. He embedded a contingency clause within the Master Estate Trust. It is a protective mechanism designed to activate under very specific conditions. It states unequivocally that if you, Richard Harris, ever attempt to extort, coerce, or publicly compel Aurora to surrender her inheritance to satisfy Julian and his debts, you immediately forfeit your status as the primary beneficiary of the remaining Harris estate. The ceramic espresso mug slipped from my father's hand. It hit the marble floor, shattering into dozens of sharp white fragments. The dark liquid splashed across the polished stone, soaking into the expensive rug. My grandfather had engineered a masterpiece of legal architecture. By staging a public extortion attempt in front of 60 affluent witnesses, Richard had unknowingly provided the exact sworn testimony required to trigger his own ruin. He had handed us the weapon. As of 8 o'clock this morning, Mitchell continued, his voice cutting through the silent foyer. The title to this estate, your commercial holding firms, and your remaining liquid assets have reverted entirely to Aurora. You are officially trespassing in her home. A sharp gasp echoed from the top of the mahogany staircase. My mother Vanessa stood frozen on the landing. She wore a pristine cashmere lounge set, her hands clutching the wooden banister. The reality of the lawyer's words struck her with physical force. The woman who had spent decades cultivating a flawless high society image realized she had just lost the very estate she used to govern her peers. Vanessa swayed, her eyes rolling back, and collapsed onto the carpeted stairs in a dead faint. Julian emerged from the guest corridor, his face pale and slick with a sudden terrified sweat. He looked at the shattered mug on the floor and then at the legal document in Mitchell's hand. The golden child, who had never faced a single consequence, realized his endless safety net had just evaporated. But arrogant men do not surrender their power gracefully. As Julian rushed to revive my mother, the initial shock on my father's face mutated into a dark, desperate fury. The veins in his neck pulsed. He looked at the document and then shifted his glare to me. The polished real estate developer vanished, replaced by a cornered predator, willing to destroy his own bloodline to survive. "You think a piece of paper signed by a dead man gives you the right to take my empire?" Richard hissed, stepping over the broken ceramic. "I built this family. You are a glorified warehouse clerk. I will tie this trust up in litigation until you are bankrupt. I will make sure you never see a single dime." He slammed the heavy oak door shut, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet morning air. Mitchell turned to me, his expression hardening. "He will not go down without a fight, Aurora. He is going to leverage every political connection and every corrupt judge in his pocket to freeze this transfer. We need to prepare for a brutal institutional stonewall." I walked back to my car, feeling the familiar cold logic of an auditor take over my mind. Richard thought he could win a war of attrition by cutting off my resources and starving me out. He believed the sheer weight of his wealthy network would crush my resolve. He failed to understand that blocking a compliance officer from her legal assets forces her to stop playing by polite civil procedures. If he wanted to hide behind the courts, I was going to bypass the local judges entirely. I was going to start hunting for the federal crimes I knew my brother was desperately trying to conceal in his shadow ledgers. The heavy oak door slammed shut behind us, cutting off my father's furious shouting. The sharp crack echoed across the manicured lawns of the Myers Park estate, dissipating into the crisp morning air. I walked down the blue stone steps beside Mitchell Sterling, the frost crunching beneath my boots. We reached the cobblestone driveway and stood by our respective vehicles. The initial adrenaline rush of delivering my grandfather's legal trap began to recede, leaving behind a cold, calculating reality. Mitchell rested his leather briefcase on the hood of his sedan, his breath plumed in the freezing temperature. "Do not underestimate the wounded pride of a wealthy man, Aurora," he warned, adjusting the collar of his charcoal topcoat. "Richard will not simply pack his bags and surrender the keys to his empire. He possesses a formidable network of highly paid corporate fixers. They will attempt to bury this transfer in endless procedural paperwork. He expects you to fold under the financial strain of a protracted civil battle." I nodded, gripping my car keys. I knew my father operated on the assumption that capital could conquer any obstacle. He viewed the judicial system not as an arbiter of truth, but as a weapon to be wielded against anyone who defied his authority. I thanked the veteran litigator, slid behind the steering wheel, and drove back toward my modest townhome. The battle lines were officially drawn, but the swiftness of my family's retaliation took my breath away. The first strike arrived less than 48 hours later. It was a Tuesday morning. I stood at the counter of a local coffee shop near my logistics firm, holding a simple cardboard cup of dark roast. I tapped my debit card against the digital payment terminal. The machine emitted a harsh, sharp beep. A red light flashed across the small screen displaying a declined transaction. I frowned, assuming it was a minor network error. I pulled out a secondary credit card and inserted the chip. Another sharp beep. Another red notification. The barista offered a sympathetic but impatient sigh, shifting her weight as the line of morning commuters pressed closer behind me. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I stepped aside, leaving the coffee on the counter, and pulled out my smartphone. I opened my mobile banking application, authenticating my identity with a quick fingerprint scan. The dashboard loaded, revealing a terrifying landscape. Every single financial portfolio bearing my name displayed a zero available balance. A glaring red banner sat across the top of the interface, indicating a hard institutional hold. I marched out to my car and dialed the customer service hotline. After navigating a maze of automated prompts, a terse banking representative informed me that my ledgers were locked pending a superior court injunction. Richard had deployed his expensive legal team to file an emergency ex parte motion. Utilizing outdated custodial data from my high school years, he convinced a local magistrate that my personal savings were inextricably commingled with the disputed inheritance. The judge who signed the order was an elected official whose recent political campaign received heavy funding from my father's real estate political action committee. The magistrate rubber-stamped the asset freeze without requiring my presence in a courtroom. In a single stroke, Richard trapped my grandfather's trust and my own meager savings in an impenetrable, bureaucratic purgatory. He severed my access to the modern economy. While my father executed the financial siege, my mother orchestrated a devastating psychological offensive. Vanessa understood that public perception dictated power in Charlotte high society. She mobilized her extensive country club network, launching a vicious, fabricated narrative designed to systematically assassinate my character. Her battlefield was the grand ballroom of the country club during their annual winter charity luncheon. Sitting among the city's elite power brokers, Vanessa dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin, painting a masterpiece of maternal grief. She whispered to the influential wives of corporate executives, claiming, "I suffered from severe psychiatric instability." The most damaging lie, however, centered around my late grandfather. She told her captive audience that I had subjected Hal to relentless elder abuse, coercing a dementia-riddled old man into altering his master estate documents during his final vulnerable days. The rumors operated like a fast-moving virus, spreading from the manicured golf courses directly into the corporate sectors. By Thursday morning, the toxic gossip breached the walls of my logistics firm. I sat at my cubicle reviewing a complex supply chain manifest when the glaring notification popped up on my monitor. The Human Resources Director requested my immediate presence in her office. I walked down the sterile, carpeted hallway, sensing the subtle shift in office dynamics. Colleagues who normally offered warm morning greetings suddenly averted their eyes, staring intently at their keyboards. The Human Resources office smelled of generic citrus air freshener and palpable discomfort. The director, a risk-averse woman named Susan, sat behind a pristine glass desk. She did not offer me a seat. She slid a single sheet of paper across the smooth surface. "Aurora, we received several anonymous communications regarding a pending legal investigation involving financial exploitation," she stated, her tone clipped and professional. "Our firm handles highly sensitive government shipping contracts. We maintain a strict moral character clause for all compliance auditors. Until these disturbing allegations are officially resolved, we must place you on indefinite, unpaid administrative leave. Please leave your security badge on the desk." I stared at the suspension notice. The pristine corporate letterhead felt like a physical blow. Vanessa had successfully weaponized her societal privilege to sever my sole source of income, isolating me entirely. I unclipped the plastic identification badge from my lapel, dropped it onto the glass desk, and walked out of the building carrying nothing but my purse. Returning to my quiet townhome, the silence felt suffocating. I sat on the edge of my sofa, staring at a stack of utility bills I could no longer pay. My family wanted me destitute, terrified, and desperate enough to settle for a fraction of my rightful inheritance. They engineered a flawless social execution, assuming the crushing weight of public humiliation and impending poverty would force my surrender. My phone vibrated against the coffee table, the screen illuminated, displaying a text message from Julian. The golden child was enjoying the view from his leased luxury penthouse, entirely shielded from the devastation his debts had caused. The message read, "Nice try, auditor, but we make the rules in this town. Sign the waiver, drop the estate claim, or starve. It is your choice." I read the glowing pixels tracing the arrogant cadence of his words. He thought the victory was secured. He believed the Harris family armor was impenetrable. But my mother and brother fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my profession. Isolating an auditor, removing her daily corporate distractions, and confining her to a quiet room does not induce panic. It provides uninterrupted time to review the hidden ledgers. They assumed my lack of income rendered me powerless. They failed to realize that stripping away my polite civil life eliminated my obligation to fight fair. I walked into my home office and booted up my primary workstation. The glow of the dual monitors cast a sharp, pale light across the room. If Richard wanted to leverage corrupt local magistrates to starve me out, I needed to elevate the battlefield. I needed to bypass the state courts entirely and uncover the federal violations my brother was so desperately trying to conceal within his flashy tech startups. 2 years prior, I developed a proprietary tracking software designed to detect phantom inventory within global shipping routes. I knew Julian, driven by his characteristic laziness, utilized a pirated version of my exact program to manage the logistical framework of his hardware company. I cracked my knuckles, resting my fingers on the mechanical keyboard. I initiated the administrative backdoor sequence, bypassing his rudimentary security protocols. The screen flickered, loading lines of raw, encrypted data. The hunt had officially begun, and I was preparing to drag my family's pristine reputation into the unforgiving light of a federal indictment. The retaliation did not begin with a formal legal summons. It began in the sunlit dining room of the Quail Hollow Club over plates of poached salmon and crystal glasses of iced tea. I was not there to witness the performance, but the whispers traveled faster than any court courier. My smartphone vibrated against my office desk shortly before noon. The caller ID displayed the name of a sympathetic junior executive at my firm, whose family also navigated those affluent social circles. Her voice trembled as she relayed the spectacle my mother had just orchestrated. Vanessa Harris did not merely gossip. She conducted psychological warfare. Seated among Charlotte power brokers, she dabbed her eyes with a pristine linen napkin and delivered a masterclass in character assassination. She told the influential wives of local chief executives that I suffered from a profound psychiatric break. She claimed my sudden estrangement was the result of a cruel manipulation. The most unforgivable lie centered on my late grandfather, Hal. My mother whispered that I had subjected him to relentless elder abuse, forcing a vulnerable man suffering from cognitive decline to rewrite his estate documents in my favor. She twisted Hal protecting me into a narrative where I preyed upon his final days. The rumors operated like a fast-moving virus, leaping from the manicured golf courses directly into the corporate sectors. In my city's social standing and business contracts are inextricably linked. The professional fallout was breathless. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, a sterile, automated email materialized in my inbox. The human resources director requested my immediate presence. I walked down the long, carpeted hallway of my logistics firm, sensing a sudden chilling shift in the office atmosphere. Colleagues who normally offered warm greetings suddenly found their monitors incredibly interesting. They averted their eyes, typing furiously to avoid acknowledging my existence. The human resources suite smelled of generic lemon air freshener and palpable discomfort. The director, a risk-averse woman named Susan, sat behind a thick glass desk. She did not stand to greet me. She did not offer a cup of water or a polite preamble. She simply slid a single printed sheet of paper across the smooth surface. Aurora, we received several anonymous communications this morning regarding an active investigation into financial exploitation, she stated, her tone clipped and devoid of empathy. Our firm manages highly sensitive government shipping contracts. We maintain a strict moral turpitude clause for all compliance auditors. Until these disturbing allegations are cleared, we must place you on an indefinite, unpaid administrative leave. I stared at the corporate letterhead. The printed words felt like a physical strike to my chest. I opened my mouth to defend myself, to explain the extortion attempt at the Christmas dinner, but Susan raised a preemptive hand. This is not a negotiation, she warned. Please leave your security badge on the desk. Security will escort you to the parking deck. Vanessa had successfully weaponized her societal privilege to sever my sole source of income. I unclipped the plastic identification badge from my lapel, dropping it onto the glass desk. The sharp clatter echoed in the quiet room. I gathered my coat and walked out of the building, flanked by a uniformed guard carrying nothing but my purse and a deep, simmering realization of my family true nature. The psychological execution was flawless, but Richard ensured the financial siege followed immediately. Driving back to my modest townhome, the low fuel indicator illuminated on my dashboard. I pulled into a corner station, stepping out into the freezing drizzle. I inserted my primary debit card into the pump terminal. The machine emitted a sharp, harsh beep. A red text prompt flashed across the small screen, indicating a declined transaction. I frowned, assuming a simple network error. I pulled out a secondary credit card. Another beep. Another glowing red rejection. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I climbed back into the driver's seat, locking the doors against the rain. I pulled out my phone and opened my mobile banking application, authenticating my identity with a quick fingerprint scan. The dashboard loaded, revealing a terrifying landscape. Every single financial portfolio bearing my name displayed a zero available balance. A glaring banner sat across the top of the interface, indicating a hard institutional hold. I dialed the customer service hotline, pressing the phone tight against my ear. After navigating a maze of automated prompts, a terse representative informed me that my ledgers were locked, pending a superior court injunction. Richard had deployed his expensive legal team to file an emergency ex parte motion. Utilizing outdated custodial data from my high school years, he convinced a local magistrate that my personal savings were inextricably commingled with the disputed inheritance trust. The judge who signed the order was an elected official whose recent political campaign received heavy funding from my father Real Estate Political Action Committee. The magistrate authorized the asset freeze without requiring my presence in a courtroom. In a single stroke, Richard trapped my grandfather trust and my own meager savings in an impenetrable bureaucratic purgatory. He severed my access to the modern economy. I could not buy a gallon of gas or a loaf of bread. I drove the rest of the way home in silence, watching the windshield wipers push away the cold rain. My townhome felt suffocating. I sat on the edge of my sofa, staring at a stack of utility bills resting on the coffee table. They wanted me destitute, terrified, and desperate enough to settle for a fraction of my rightful inheritance. They assumed the crushing weight of public humiliation and impending poverty would force my surrender. My phone vibrated against the cushion. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from Julian. The golden child was enjoying the view from his leased luxury penthouse, entirely shielded from the devastation his debts had caused. The message read, "Nice try, auditor, but we make the rules in this town. Sign the waiver, drop the estate claim, or starve. It is your choice." I read the glowing pixels tracing the arrogant cadence of his words. He thought the victory was secured. He believed the Harris family armor was impenetrable. But my mother and brother fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my profession. Isolating an auditor, removing her daily corporate distractions, and confining her to a quiet room does not induce panic. It provides uninterrupted time to review the hidden ledgers. They assumed my lack of income rendered me powerless. They failed to realize that stripping away my polite civil life eliminated my obligation to fight fair. Why use a sledgehammer to kill a fly? If my father merely suffered a temporary cash flow crisis, he would not orchestrate a multi-front attack involving corrupt judges and intricate smear campaigns. Men like Richard Harris only unleash this level of destruction when they are hiding an extinction-level event. I walked into my home office and booted up my primary workstation. The glow of the dual monitors cast a sharp, pale light across the dark room. If Richard wanted to leverage local magistrates to starve me out, I needed to elevate the battlefield. I needed to bypass the state courts entirely and uncover the federal violations my brother was so desperately trying to conceal within his flashy tech startups. 2 years prior, I developed a proprietary tracking software designed to detect phantom inventory within global shipping routes. I knew Julian, driven by his characteristic laziness, utilized a pirated version of my exact program to manage the logistical framework of his hardware company. I cracked my knuckles, resting my fingers on the mechanical keyboard. I initiated the administrative backdoor sequence, bypassing his rudimentary security protocols. The screen flickered, loading lines of raw, encrypted data. The hunt had officially begun, and the initial shipping manifests, decoding on my screen, suggested Julian was not running a failing tech venture. He was hiding a crime so severe it would drag my entire family into the crosshairs of an international syndicate. The morning sun filtered through the narrow blinds of my home office, casting sharp, parallel shadows across the mahogany desk. I sat in silence, staring at the printed copy of the Superior Court injunction Mitchell Sterling had couriered over before dawn. The document bore the heavy black signature of Judge Thomas Caldwell. It was a pristine piece of legal fiction designed to validate my father and his extortion. Judge Caldwell did not possess a reputation for impartial jurisprudence. He was an elected official whose recent re-election campaign survived solely on a sudden influx of capital from an anonymous political action committee. I spent 10 minutes cross-referencing the donor registry with public tax records. The trail led directly back to a subsidiary of Richard Harris and his commercial real estate empire. My father had not merely hired elite attorneys to freeze my assets. He owned the referee presiding over the match. My phone vibrated against the desk, breaking the quiet stillness of the room. Mitchell Sterling's name illuminated the screen. I swiped the green icon and held the device to my ear. "He stonewalled us," Aurora Mitchell stated, his voice rasped and heavy with fatigue. "I filed an emergency motion to lift the freeze on your personal checking accounts, arguing they hold zero relation to the disputed inheritance trust." Judge Caldwell denied the motion without granting a hearing. He placed the entire docket on a 90-day administrative hold. 90 days, I repeated, letting the words hang in the cold air. "It is a starvation tactic," Mitchell explained. "Richard knows you lack the liquid capital to endure a 3-month legal siege. Your firm suspended your salary. Your credit lines are locked. He expects the physical reality of poverty to crush your resolve long before we ever set foot inside a courtroom. Let me wire you a personal loan to cover your mortgage and groceries." I looked at the stack of utility bills resting near my keyboard. I felt the hollow ache in my stomach, having skipped dinner the previous night to conserve my remaining pantry staples of rice and canned beans. The isolation was total. My mother and her country club smear campaign ensured no one in my professional network would risk their reputation to throw me a lifeline. My family had successfully engineered an environment of maximum deprivation. "I appreciate the offer, Mitchell," I replied, keeping my tone flat and unyielding. "But taking your money validates their strategy. It means I accept their rules of engagement. I am done waiting for a corrupt local judge to grant me permission to survive." I ended the call and placed the phone face down. Julian's mocking text message from the previous evening echoed in my mind. He boasted from his luxury penthouse that the Harris family made the rules in this town. He advised me to sign the waiver or starve. My brother and my parents operated under the delusion that stripping away my polite civil life rendered me powerless. They failed to realize that forcing a compliance auditor into a corner simply removes her obligation to fight fair. If the state judicial system operated as a shielded country club for wealthy developers, I needed to elevate the battlefield. I needed to bypass the civil courts entirely and hunt for the federal violations my brother concealed beneath his flashy corporate exterior. I turned my attention to the dual monitors illuminating the dark office. 2 years prior, I developed a highly specialized tracking software program. I engineered the algorithm to detect phantom inventory within complex maritime supply chains, flagging discrepancies between digital shipping manifests and physical port dock receipts. Julian, driven by his characteristic laziness and an insatiable need for unearned glory, stole a copy of my source code from an unsecured family server. He hired a cheap graphic designer to slap a sleek, minimalist interface over my architecture and pitched the stolen program to venture capitalists as a revolutionary artificial intelligence logistics platform. He built his entire tech startup upon the foundation of my intellectual property. My brother was a master of illusion, but he was a terrible programmer. I knew he never bothered to rewrite the core administrative protocols. I cracked my knuckles, resting my fingertips on the mechanical keyboard. I opened a command terminal and initiated the backdoor sequence I originally coded into the framework. The screen flickered, bypassing his rudimentary firewalls with effortless precision. Lines of raw encrypted data cascaded down the monitors. I was inside the central nervous system of Julian Harris and his corporate empire. The hunt officially commenced. I pulled the master ledgers, cross-referencing Julian's reported outward shipments with the actual United States Customs and Border Protection database. The discrepancy materialized within minutes. It was not a minor accounting error. It was a gaping black hole. Julian claimed to be manufacturing and shipping thousands of high-end encrypted server racks to international clients. He used these projected sales to secure millions of dollars in continuous funding from private investors. I checked the specific cargo container numbers listed on his internal manifests. I ran those identical numbers through the Federal Port Authority logs. The cargo containers did not exist. The serial numbers were fabricated. The hardware was a ghost. Julian was not running a struggling tech venture. He was operating a textbook Ponzi scheme, utilizing fresh investor capital to pay off early backers while skimming exorbitant amounts to fund his penthouse, leased exotic cars, and designer wardrobe. But a Ponzi scheme of this magnitude required an endless influx of cash to prevent a catastrophic collapse. The moment the new investment slowed, the entire structure would implode. I pulled the internal banking routing tables, searching for the source of his most recent capital injections. The data revealed a terrifying truth about my father. Richard Harris was not an innocent bystander throwing away good money to support a failing son. The ledger showed a relentless, systemic hemorrhage of capital flowing directly from Richard's legitimate commercial real estate firm into Julian's fraudulent tech startup. My father disguised the massive cash transfers as consulting fees and logistical research grants. He was bleeding his own empire dry to prop up Julian's illusion. This explained the desperate holiday ambush. Richard needed my $500,000 inheritance to plug a fatal leak in his own sinking ship. I leaned closer to the monitor, the glow reflecting in my eyes. I tracked the outgoing wire transfers. If Richard was pouring millions into the startup, where was the money going? Julian lived lavishly, but his personal expenses did not account for the sheer volume of disappearing capital. The money did not stay in local Charlotte bank accounts. It did not go to domestic investors. I watched the digital routing trail fracture into dozens of smaller, structured payments designed to slip beneath the radar of federal banking oversight. The payments funneled through 3 domestic shell companies before shooting overseas. The final destination was a holding firm registered in the Cayman Islands. The chilling reality settled over me like a heavy winter shroud. Julian did not just defraud wealthy local executives. He accepted capital from an unregulated shadow bank. He took millions from a syndicate that operated far outside the boundaries of the law. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling the archived communications from Julian's executive email server. I found a hidden encrypted folder containing correspondence with the offshore entity. I decrypted the most recent message, dated just 3 days before the Christmas Eve dinner. The email was not a polite request for a quarterly earnings report. It was a brutal, unyielding demand for the immediate return of $2.5 million. The language carried explicit threats of physical retaliation if the deadline was ignored. My breath caught in my throat. My parents were not trying to extort my inheritance to save their social standing. They were staging a ransom gathering. They needed my money to buy Julian a fake passport and a plane ticket before the syndicate sent enforcers to collect the debt. The civil dispute over a grandfather's trust was dead. I had just uncovered a sprawling conspiracy involving wire fraud, international money laundering, and cartel debt. My father thought he cornered a helpless daughter in a rigged local court. He had no idea I held the digital evidence to bury his entire bloodline in a federal penitentiary. The silence inside my townhome felt heavy and dense. My bank accounts were frozen, and my corporate job was suspended, leaving me marooned on an island of my own making. I sat in my home office, watching the dust motes drift through a single beam of afternoon sunlight. My mother and father believed this isolation would act as a pressure cooker. They thought a working-class woman stripped of her daily routine and her financial safety net would inevitably panic. They expected me to pace the floor, stare at my unpaid utility bills, and eventually pick up the phone to surrender my inheritance. They failed to realize that forcing a compliance auditor into a quiet room is a tactical error. Isolation is the natural habitat of an investigator. I did not feel fear. I felt a cold, pristine focus taking root in my chest. I opened my laptop and adjusted the brightness of the dual monitors illuminating the dark corners of the room. 2 years ago, I spent my evenings developing a highly specialized, proprietary software program for my logistics firm. The architecture was designed to untangle complex global maritime supply chains. The algorithm searched for phantom inventory by cross-referencing digital shipping manifests with actual physical weight receipts at international ports. It was an elegant piece of mathematics built to catch corporate thieves. My brother Julian understood the psychology of venture capital, but he possessed zero technical skill. His arrogance was matched only by his profound laziness. When he decided to launch his groundbreaking tech hardware startup, he needed a logistical framework to show his prospective investors. He did not hire a development team. He accessed an unsecured family cloud server, stole the source code of my software, and paid a cheap graphic designer to drape a sleek minimalist interface over my architecture. He built a fraudulent empire upon the foundation of my intellectual property. Julian was a master of the corporate pitch, but he was a terrible programmer. I knew he never possessed the capability to locate, much less rewrite the core administrative protocols I had buried deep within the original code. I rested my fingertips on the mechanical keyboard, listening to the sharp, rhythmic clicking as I typed. I bypassed the public-facing portal of his company website and initiated the administrative backdoor sequence. The sleek investor graphics melted away, replaced by lines of raw, unformatted data cascading down my screen. I was inside the central nervous system of his corporate network. The hunt officially commenced. I pulled the master shipping ledgers. Julian claimed to manufacture high-end encrypted server racks, selling them to boutique overseas clients. He utilized these projected international sales to secure continuous rounds of funding from eager private investors. I isolated a batch of his most recent outward shipments, targeting the specific cargo container serial numbers listed on his internal company manifests. I opened a separate browser window and accessed the Federal Port Authority database. I entered the container numbers and initiated a cross-reference protocol. The search query returned an error. I ran a secondary trace utilizing the designated bill of lading numbers. The result was identical. The cargo containers did not exist. The serial numbers were fabricated. The hardware was a ghost. Julian was not running a struggling tech venture. He was operating a colossal Ponzi scheme. He collected millions of dollars from investors for server racks that were never manufactured. He generated fake invoices to demonstrate imaginary revenue growth, using those metrics to lure in fresh capital. But a financial scheme of this magnitude operates like a furnace. It requires a constant influx of cash to prevent a catastrophic collapse. The moment the new investments slowed, the early backers would demand their promised dividends. The entire structure would implode. I pulled the internal banking routing tables, searching for the source of his most recent capital injections. The data loading on my screen revealed a terrifying truth about my father. Richard Harris was not an innocent bystander throwing away good money to support a failing son. The ledgers displayed a relentless, systemic hemorrhage of capital flowing directly from the legitimate commercial real estate firm owned by Richard into the fraudulent tech startup owned by Julian. My father disguised these immense cash transfers under the guise of consulting fees and logistical research grants. He was bleeding his own empire dry to prop up Julian and his endless illusion. He funneled his corporate holding funds through a labyrinth of shell limited liability companies registered in Delaware. These ghost companies scrubbed the origin of the money before depositing it into the startup accounts to cover the phantom dividend payments. My parents were not just demanding my inheritance out of simple greed. They were active co-conspirators in a sprawling money laundering operation. The Christmas Eve extortion attempt suddenly snapped into sharp, logical focus. Richard had drained his own liquidity to keep the scheme afloat. The $500,000 trust left by my grandfather was the last available patch for a sinking ship. They needed my money to plug the fatal hole before the federal regulatory agencies noticed the discrepancies in their tax filings. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue glow reflecting in my eyes. I tracked the outgoing wire transfers. If Richard was pouring his real estate wealth into the startup, where was the money going? Julian lived lavishly, but the cost of his penthouse and leased vehicles did not account for the sheer volume of disappearing capital. The money did not stay in local Charlotte bank accounts. It did not go to domestic investors. I watched the digital routing trail fracture into dozens of smaller, structured payments. These fractional wires were intentionally designed to slip beneath the radar of standard banking oversight. The payments funneled through the domestic shell companies before shooting overseas. The final destination was a holding firm registered in the Cayman Islands. The chilling reality settled over me like a heavy winter shroud. Julian did not just defraud wealthy local executives. He accepted initial seed capital from an unregulated shadow bank. He took millions from a syndicate that operated far outside the boundaries of the law. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling the archived communications from the executive email server. I located a hidden encrypted folder containing correspondence with the offshore entity. I decrypted the most recent message, dated just 3 days before the Christmas Eve dinner. The email was not a polite request for a quarterly earnings report. It was a brutal, unyielding demand for the immediate return of $2.5 million. The language carried explicit promises of physical retaliation if the deadline was ignored. My breath caught in my throat. My parents were not staging a simple family shakedown. They were orchestrating a ransom gathering. They needed my money to buy Julian a fake passport and a private flight out of the country before the syndicate sent enforcers to collect the debt. The civil dispute over a grandfather and his trust was officially dead. I had just uncovered a sprawling conspiracy involving wire fraud, international money laundering, and cartel debt. My father thought he cornered a helpless daughter in a rigged local court, utilizing a corrupt judge to freeze my checking accounts. He had no idea I held the digital evidence to bury his entire bloodline in a federal penitentiary. I activated my laser printer. The machine hummed to life, the mechanical rollers pulling fresh sheets of paper. I printed every routing schematic, every fabricated shipping manifest, and every threatening offshore email. I stacked the warm pages, sliding them into a thick, sterile blue folder. The war had just escalated to the federal level, and I needed to deliver this evidence directly into the hands of the man who thought he had broken me. The Charlotte Symphony Gala was approaching, and I had the perfect New Year Eve gift prepared for my father. The thick blue folder sat on the corner of my mahogany desk. It contained every printed routing schematic, every fabricated shipping manifest, and every decrypted offshore email I had extracted from Julian and his breached server. The physical evidence of my family and their sprawling money laundering operation was undeniable. Yet as I stared at the stack of warm paper, a nagging discrepancy began to echo in my mind. As a logistics auditor, my brain is trained to hunt for numerical friction, and the math sitting in front of me simply did not align. The offshore syndicate demanded $2.5 million. The decrypted email explicitly stated that returning this exact sum was the only way to avoid severe physical retaliation. But the inheritance trust my father attempted to extort from me on Christmas Eve was valued at $500,000. The deficit was $2 million. Why would Richard Harris, a man obsessed with his high society reputation, stage a public extortion attempt for a fraction of the required ransom? Even if I handed over the trust without a fight, it would not satisfy the shadow creditors. It would barely cover the interest on Julian and his illicit debt. My father was a ruthless real estate developer, but he was not bad at math. He knew the numbers fell short. I pushed my chair back from the monitors, the wheels gliding over the hardwood floor. I walked to the small, fireproof safe tucked inside my closet. I spun the combination dial, the heavy metal tumblers clicking into place. I reached inside and pulled out the master estate portfolio Mitchell Sterling had provided to me months ago. It was a dense collection of legal parchment, smelling faintly of old ink and bound leather. I carried the portfolio back to the glow of the monitors. If the answer was not hidden in Julian and his digital ledgers, it had to be buried in my grandfather and his legal architecture. Hal Harris was a man who measured worth in tangible assets rather than liquid cash. He built his textile and supply empire brick by brick, starting on a factory floor and eventually purchasing the entire industrial park. He recognized my father and his fatal flaw early on. Hal knew Richard harbored a hollow hunger for prestige, prioritizing country club memberships and bespoke suits over sustainable business practices. My grandfather always warned me that Richard would eventually leverage the family foundation for quick capital to maintain his illusion of superiority. To prevent this, Hal carved out the beating heart of the corporate infrastructure before he passed away. I flipped past the standard boilerplate clauses, tracing my finger down to Schedule A, the section detailing the specific assets enclosed within the trust. I read the fine print, leaning closer to the desk lamp. The $500,000 figure was not a liquid cash balance. It was a static tax valuation assessed over a decade ago. The actual asset enclosed within the trust was a controlling 51% equity stake in a specific corporate entity named Apex Holding Partners. A cold sweat prickled along my hairline. The ambient temperature in my office seemed to drop 10 degrees. I turned back to my primary monitor, highlighting the digital routing traces I had just extracted from the server. I ran the name Apex Holding Partners through the search terminal, analyzing the labyrinth of shell limited liability companies Richard was utilizing to scrub the dirty money. The search query returned a pristine match. The cursor blinked steadily beside the name. Apex Holding Partners was the primary domestic artery. It was the exact shell company my father used to receive clean capital from his real estate firm, generate fake consulting invoices, to mix the funds, and then wire the washed money directly to the Cayman Islands. The true nature of the Christmas Eve ambush clicked into place, bringing a wave of profound nausea. The realization hit my chest like a physical strike, forcing the breath from my lungs. Richard was not begging for a cash injection. He was executing a liability transfer. By demanding I sign the waiver in front of 60 affluent witnesses, my father was attempting to legally force me to assume ownership and executive control of the very entity laundering international shadow capital. If I surrendered the trust, I became the majority shareholder of a criminal enterprise at the exact moment the music was preparing to stop. The trap was diabolical. When the offshore syndicate realized the money was gone and their deadline expired, they would hunt the names listed on the corporate registry. When the federal regulatory agencies inevitably raided the accounts tracing the fraudulent wire transfers, the paper trail would point directly to the chief executive officer. It would point to me. My father was setting me up to take the fall. He intended to offer his youngest daughter to the wolves, buying Julian a clean slate and providing enough time to secure a flight to a non-extradition country. My parents weighed the survival of their 2 children and chose to sacrifice the logistics auditor to save the golden boy. Vanessa sending me text messages telling me I was strong enough to survive was not a mother offering harsh, tough love. She was an accomplice, soothing her own conscience as she watched her husband push me onto the train tracks. The level of betrayal transcended toxic parenting. It was predatory. I sat in the quiet room listening to the steady hum of my computer tower. For 28 years, I operated under the assumption that my family viewed me as a disappointment. I accepted my role as the invisible workhorse, standing in the shadows while Julian soaked up the applause. I thought they simply did not care about me. I now understood they viewed me as a disposable asset. I was a human shield waiting to be deployed. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet, darkened street of my neighborhood. The streetlights cast long, pale shadows across the wet pavement. I did not feel a sudden urge to weep. The capacity for tears burns away when you realize the people who gave you life are actively trying to destroy it. The hollow ache of rejection hardened, morphing into a cold, unyielding armor. They wanted me to be the scapegoat. I decided to become the executioner. I turned my attention to the calendar resting on my desk. The decrypted email from the Cayman Islands syndicate gave Julian and Richard 1 week to return the $2.5 million. It was currently day 4 of that timeline. The hourglass was nearly empty. My refusal to sign the trust documents on Christmas Eve had derailed their entire escape plan. By invoking the poison pill clause and freezing the estate, Mitchell Sterling effectively locked my father out of his own life raft. Richard could not legally transfer the liability of Apex Holding Partners to my name. He could not offer me to the syndicate as a peace offering. I analyzed the psychological profile of the man who raised me. Richard Harris was arrogant, but he was not paralyzed. Desperate men facing violent creditors do not simply accept defeat and wait for the enforcers to knock on their door. If they cannot coax a signature using social pressure and psychological warfare, they cross lines from which they can never return. My father needed me to absorb a colossal debt before the weekend arrived. If the corrupt local judge could not deliver my consent through the civil courts, Richard would have to manufacture it. He would need a binding document bearing my name, one strong enough to satisfy the shadow bankers breathing down his neck. I looked at the blue folder resting on my desk. The war had moved beyond estate laws and bruised egos. We were entering the realm of federal forgery, and the next move my father made was going to seal his fate forever. The rain lashed against the windows of my townhome in relentless gray sheets, washing the streets of Charlotte in a cold winter downpour. The Tuesday afternoon offered zero warmth and very little light. I sat at my mahogany desk organizing the printed routing schematics and decrypted offshore emails into a sterile blue folder. My coffee had grown tepid. A sharp ping from my laptop disrupted the steady rhythm of the rain hitting the glass. An incoming message flashed across my secondary monitor, demanding immediate attention. The sender domain did not belong to my suspended logistics firm or to my grandfather and his estate attorney. It bore the insignia of a high-tier commercial collection agency known for handling distressed corporate debt. The subject line indicated an urgent notice of default. I clicked the icon, allowing the encrypted attachment to load on the screen. The page filled with dense legal typography, bearing the harsh, sterile formatting of shadow banking. It was a commercial bridge loan origination contract. This specific type of document details a short-term injection of capital designed to float a company until a larger funding round can be secured. The primary debtor listed on the first page was Julian and his fraudulent tech hardware startup. The principal amount requested was $1.5 million. The interest rate was predatory, reflecting the unregulated nature of the Cayman Islands syndicate providing the cash. I scrolled down past the repayment terms, reaching the final page of the contract. The breath caught in my throat, leaving a cold vacuum in my chest. The guarantor section sat at the bottom of the page. This specific clause designates the individual personally responsible for the debt if the primary company defaults on the payments. The typed name filling the guarantor box was Aurora Harris. Beneath the printed name sat my full Social Security number and the routing details of a dormant checking account I opened during my sophomore year of high school. A sharp, elegant signature rested on the final dotted line. It was an impeccable replica of my cursive handwriting. Richard had executed a desperate criminal maneuver. The ticking clock of the syndicate ultimatum had pushed him into a state of sheer, unadulterated panic. When Mitchell Sterling froze the estate and blocked the legal transfer of the trust, my father realized he could not hand me the holding company directly. He needed a different mechanism to satisfy the offshore creditors. He dug into his personal archives, extracting my outdated financial profiles to generate a fresh layer of corporate insulation. He forged my signature on this high-yield loan, shifting the crushing liability of Julian and his phantom tech empire directly onto my shoulders. He presented this fabricated guarantee to the syndicate lawyers, buying a temporary extension to save his golden child. My smartphone buzzed, vibrating against the edge of the desk. The screen illuminated, displaying a text message from Vanessa. I picked up the device, reading the paragraphs my mother had carefully drafted. She did not express remorse. She framed the federal felony as a necessary family burden. She wrote that they had to make this choice to save the life of my brother. She told me I was strong, resilient, and capable of starting over. She claimed I could survive a personal bankruptcy filing, but Julian lacked the constitution for such a hardship. She stated he would not survive the physical retaliation of the creditors or the confines of a prison cell. I set the phone down beside the keyboard. The screen faded to black. My own mother was attempting to soothe her conscience while offering me as a human sacrifice. They had thrown me to the wolves, assuming my deeply ingrained familial loyalty would hold firm. They operated under the assumption that a quiet logistics auditor would shrink under the terrifying weight of a 7-figure cartel debt. They believed the fear of public ruin and relentless harassment from brutal collection agencies would force me to silently absorb the crime. In their minds, I was a disposable asset, born solely to absorb the collateral damage generated by their favored son. They expected me to weep, to panic, and to ultimately accept my role as the scapegoat. They wanted me to call them, begging for guidance so they could dictate the terms of my surrender. I did not burst into tears. The raw sting of rejection had already calloused into a protective armor days ago. I turned my attention back to the high-resolution scan of the forged contract. A seasoned compliance auditor lives and dies by the digital paper trail. We are trained to ignore the intimidating sum at the top of a ledger and focus on the microscopic structural details at the bottom. A lie cannot hold weight if the foundation contains friction. I utilized my trackpad to magnify the signature block, zooming in on the lower right corner of the page. A legal commercial loan of this magnitude requires a verified witness. Richard knew the syndicate would reject a naked signature. He needed a licensed notary public to authenticate the document. A faint blue circular stamp sat perfectly centered beneath my forged name. It belonged to a local Charlotte notary, likely a corrupt associate on my father's payroll, willing to look the other way for a generous fee. The stamp provided the official seal of approval, validating the transaction in the eyes of the law. But Richard was a real estate developer, accustomed to delegating the fine details to his subordinates. When operating in a state of blind panic, he overlooked the fundamental physics of time and space. I read the handwritten date and the precise time of execution recorded by the notary just above the blue stamp. The contract was officially signed and witnessed on a specific Thursday afternoon at exactly 2 o'clock. A slow, cold smile broke across my face. The tension radiating through my muscles evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of impending victory. I pushed my chair back, opening a secured drawer in my desk to retrieve my professional corporate calendar. I cross-referenced the date printed on the forged syndicate loan with my archived employment logs. I did not need to search my memory. The schedule was documented, verified, and backed by federal security protocols. My father had committed severe federal forgery to save his empire. He fabricated a document designed to destroy my financial future and hand me over to offshore predators. But he made a fatal scheduling error. On that exact Thursday afternoon, at that precise hour, I was nowhere near a downtown Charlotte boardroom. I was not sitting across from a corrupt notary signing away my life. The paper trail my father created was about to collide with a biometric reality he could not erase. The trap he set for me contained a glaring structural flaw, and I possessed the precise tools required to turn his weapon against him. I picked up my phone and dialed the private number for Mitchell Sterling. The time for waiting in the shadows was over. We were going to build an impenetrable fortress of physical evidence, and we were going to let my parents walk blindly into a federal trap of their own making. The phone line hummed with a quiet static before Mitchell Sterling answered. I did not offer a greeting. I simply instructed the veteran litigator to check his encrypted email server. I sat at my mahogany desk listening to the faint tapping of his keyboard on the other end of the line. A tense silence stretched across the connection as he opened the commercial bridge loan document. I heard the sharp intake of his breath when he reached the final page and saw my forged signature resting above his client's social security number. "Richard has lost his mind," Mitchell whispered, his voice tight with professional disbelief. "This is a severe federal offense, Aurora. He handed you a cartel debt. If the syndicate enforces this contract, they will bypass the civil courts entirely." "Look closely at the notary seal," I replied, keeping my tone flat and analytical. "Read the date and the timestamp." Another pause followed. "Thursday the 14th, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. What am I missing?" "I was not in Charlotte," I stated. "I was standing on a concrete dock 200 miles away." I explained the precise logistical reality of my profession. A compliance auditor does not spend every day confined to a sterile cubicle crunching numbers on a spreadsheet. We conduct rigorous physical inspections to verify the integrity of international shipping routes. On that specific Thursday, I was deployed to the coast. I spent the entire afternoon at the Port of Wilmington, conducting a high-level maritime security audit. You cannot simply stroll into a federal shipping hub wearing a business suit and a smile. The port is a fortified perimeter. Entering the restricted cargo zones requires navigating a labyrinth of biometric security checkpoints. I told Mitchell we did not need to argue my whereabouts using circumstantial character witnesses. We could map my physical coordinates down to the exact square meter. Mitchell did not hesitate. He instructed me to gather every digital footprint I could legally access. I spent the next 48 hours transforming my home office into a war room. I contacted my cellular service provider requesting the raw geographic location data broadcast by my mobile device during that specific week. The carrier generated a pristine digital map. It showed my phone traveling steadily down Interstate 40, leaving the Charlotte city limits at dawn, and remaining pinged to the coastal cell towers until long after the sun went down. But a cell phone only proves the location of a device. It does not prove the presence of the user. I needed physical authentication. I logged into my secured employee portal, bypassing my suspended status, to access my personal travel logs. I downloaded the time-stamped biometric entry receipts from the Wilmington facility. Every time I passed through a restricted chain-link gate, I had to press my thumb against a glass reader and scan my retinas. The federal database recorded those unique physical markers. The logs generated a flawless chronological timeline. At 1:55 in the afternoon, just 5 minutes before my father supposedly watched me sign a commercial loan in a corporate boardroom, my retinas were being scanned by a coastal security terminal. The digital footprint was solid, but Mitchell required a human element to seal the prosecutorial vault. We arranged a secure video conference with the United States Customs agent I had shadowed during the coastal inspection. His name was Agent Miller. He was a meticulous professional who remembered my visit distinctly because I had located a subtle weight discrepancy in a manifest involving imported steel. Mitchell drafted a sworn affidavit detailing the precise timeline of that Thursday afternoon. Agent Miller reviewed the document, verifying that I was standing shoulder to shoulder with him, inspecting a rusted shipping container at the exact moment my signature magically materialized on a syndicate debt contract. Miller signed the statement, stamping it with his own official federal credential. We did not just build an alibi. We constructed a lethal prosecutorial dossier. I printed the cellular routing maps, the biometric scan receipts, and the sworn affidavit on crisp white paper. I collated the warm sheets, placing them alongside the decoded offshore emails and the phantom shipping manifests I extracted from Julian and his breached server. I slid the entire stack into a sterile blue folder. The folder rested on my desk, holding enough evidence to dismantle my entire bloodline. Mitchell drove to my townhome that evening to review the physical arsenal. He sat on my sofa reading through the pages. The seasoned litigator shook his head, a rare grin breaking across his weathered face. "Richard thinks he cornered you in a rigged civil court," Mitchell noted, closing the folder. He expects us to schedule a mediation hearing with Judge Caldwell to debate the authenticity of the signature. He expects a protracted legal fight over handwriting experts. We are not taking this to a state judge, I replied, leaning against the door frame. Mitchell nodded in agreement. No, we are bypassing the local circuit entirely. We are taking this directly to the United States Attorney. This is interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and money laundering. The federal prosecutors will not issue a polite subpoena. They will initiate a raid. But a tactical complication hovered over our strategy. The offshore syndicate had given Julian a tight deadline to return the $2.5 million. If we triggered a federal raid prematurely, Richard might panic. He still controlled liquid capital hidden in various clean accounts. If he sensed the federal net closing, he could initiate a rapid series of international wire transfers, draining his remaining empire and securing a flight out of the country before the authorities froze his assets. We needed my father to feel safe. We needed him to believe his criminal maneuver was a brilliant success. If he felt secure, he would proceed with his normal banking routines, entirely unaware of the invisible trap waiting to snap shut. He needs a false victory, I told Mitchell, pouring 2 cups of black coffee. He needs to think, I am broken. Mitchell took the ceramic mug, his eyes narrowing as he calculated the psychological angle. How do we convince a ruthless real estate developer that he has won? We give him a surrender, I answered. The annual Charlotte Symphony Gala was approaching. It was the crown jewel of the high society winter season. My parents hosted the event at their prestigious country club, treating the evening as a royal coronation. Every prominent executive, politician, and socialite would be in attendance. It was the perfect stage for a theatrical concession. Richard would expect me to show up desperate and terrified by the looming commercial collection agency. He would anticipate a tearful plea for mercy. I told Mitchell I would attend the gala. I would wear a simple dress, keep my head bowed, and let my father guide me into a quiet corner. I would play the role of the defeated scapegoat, willing to sign whatever non-disclosure agreement he placed in front of me just to stop the pain. Mitchell studied my face, assessing my resolve. You will have to look him in the eye and pretend he has crushed you. You will have to sign a meaningless paper and let him gloat. Can you stomach that level of humiliation? I looked at the blue folder resting on the mahogany desk. I felt no hesitation and zero dread. I can stomach anything if it ensures he never sees the sun from outside a prison yard again, I said. We finalized the plan as the winter night settled over the city. I was going to walk into the glittering ballroom, surrounded by the very people who had participated in my professional ruin. I was going to offer my father the ultimate red herring, lowering his defenses so the federal prosecutors could finalize their asset seizure protocols. The new year was about to arrive, bringing a reckoning my family would never survive. The winter air hovering over the Quail Hollow Club felt brittle and sharp. It was New Year's Eve, and the sprawling estate glowed under thousands of strung fairy lights illuminating the manicured grounds. A line of imported sedans and luxury sport utility vehicles stretched down the winding driveway, waiting for the valet attendants. My parents treated this annual charity gala as their personal kingdom. They stood at the apex of Charlotte high society, greeting executives and politicians while hiding a shadow syndicate debt that threatened to swallow them whole. I parked my reliable sedan 3 blocks away in a dimly lit overflow lot. I did not wear a designer gown or statement jewelry. I chose a simple, unbranded black dress, opting for flat, dark shoes that allowed me to move silently across marble floors. I needed to look like a woman who had spent the last 2 weeks drowning in unpaid bills and professional ruin. I needed to project defeat. I bypassed the main entrance and the velvet ropes. My years working in supply chain logistics taught me the structural layout of commercial venues. I walked around the perimeter, slipping through the bustling catering corridor, where exhausted servers carried trays of roasted winter vegetables and champagne flutes. I blended into the background, stepping seamlessly from the chaotic kitchen into the edge of the grand ballroom. The space smelled of expensive floral perfume and melting ice sculptures. A string quartet played a bright classical arrangement in the corner. I scanned the room, staying near the velvet-draped walls. I spotted my mother, Vanessa, standing near a towering centerpiece of white orchids. She wore a stunning emerald gown, laughing lightly, holding a crystal flute. She looked radiant, entirely unburdened by the fact that she had just offered her daughter to an offshore cartel. Her performance was flawless. But I was not looking for my mother. I needed the architect of the forgery. I navigated the perimeter of the room, moving toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the stone terrace. The patio offered a quiet refuge from the suffocating heat of the ballroom. I pushed the glass door open, stepping out into the biting December wind. Richard and Julian stood near the stone balustrade. They wore crisp, custom tuxedos, but the dim lighting revealed the fraying edges of their composure. They smoked thick cigars, the glowing embers burning bright orange in the dark. Julian tapped his polished shoe against the stone, a nervous rhythm betraying his underlying panic. The shadow bankers had given them a tight deadline, and time was running out. They needed my signature to formalize the liability transfer and finalize their escape. I paused, taking a deep, steadying breath. I channeled the raw, agonizing sting of their betrayal, utilizing the memory of my frozen bank accounts and my suspended career to summon a genuine physical reaction. I let my shoulders drop forward, slumping my posture. I allowed my hands to tremble slightly. I transformed myself from a meticulous compliance auditor into a broken, desperate scapegoat. I stepped out of the shadows, walking slowly into their line of sight. Julian saw me first. He nudged our father, pointing a cigar toward my approaching figure. Richard turned, his eyes narrowing as he assessed my defeated posture. The nervous tension draining from his face was replaced by a swift, predatory triumph. He saw exactly what he expected to see, a working-class woman crushed under the weight of his institutional power. "You win," I whispered, staring down at the stone tiles. My voice wavered, carrying the perfect pitch of exhaustion. "I cannot fight the collection agencies anymore. Please, just make it stop." Richard did not offer a comforting embrace. He offered a cold, calculated nod. He glanced around the terrace, ensuring no other guests hovered nearby. He tossed his cigar over the balustrade, grabbed my elbow with a firm, unyielding grip, and steered me back inside the building. We bypassed the crowded ballroom, moving quickly down a quiet, carpeted hallway toward the private coat check room. The space smelled of damp wool, expensive leather jackets, and cedar hangers. Julian followed closely behind, shutting the heavy wooden door and standing guard like a sentry. Richard reached into the breast pocket of his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a folded stack of legal documents and smoothed them flat on a small wooden table used for organizing scarves and gloves. The harsh fluorescent lighting of the coat room illuminated the dense paragraphs. I looked down at the paperwork. The top sheet was a stringent non-disclosure agreement binding me to permanent silence regarding the trust and the commercial loan. The subsequent pages contained the formal transfer protocols, shifting the 51% equity stake of the holding company into his name, while cementing my status as the sole guarantor of the syndicate debt. "Sign the lines at the bottom," Richard instructed, his tone dripping with condescending authority. "You absorb the loan, you drop the estate claim, and you keep your mouth shut. In exchange, I will wire $50,000 into a fresh checking account tomorrow morning. It is enough seed money for you to start over in a different city." $50,000 to shoulder a $1.5 million cartel debt. The sheer audacity of the bribe was staggering. He was offering me pennies to stand on the train tracks while he drove the locomotive away. "You forged my name on that loan," I whimpered, forcing a single tear to spill over my lower lash line. "You handed me to those offshore creditors. How could you do that to your own daughter?" Julian scoffed, rolling his eyes and leaning against the coats. "Oh, stop crying, Aurora. You have no idea the kind of pressure we are facing. We had to redirect the liability to protect the core family assets. You are single. You have no dependents. A bankruptcy will not end your life. We did what was necessary to ensure the survival of the Harris legacy," Richard added, tapping a rigid finger against the signature line. "I needed a buffer to satisfy the Cayman lenders while I organize our outbound transfers. You were the only available asset. It is your duty to carry this weight. Now pick up the pen and finalize the arrangement before I rescind the cash offer and leave you to face those enforcers alone." They had just spoken their motives aloud, detailing the forgery, the offshore creditors, and the outbound escape plan. I reached into my small black clutch. I did not take the cheap plastic pen Richard offered. I pulled out a sleek silver fountain pen I had purchased the previous day from a specialized security vendor. I unfastened the cap. My hands shook, creating a pathetic display of surrender as I leaned over the wooden table. I pressed the nib against the thick cardstock, tracing my signature across the non-disclosure agreement and the trust transfer protocols. I signed away my inheritance. I signed my name to the syndicate debt. I gave them every piece of paper they demanded, weeping silently as the ink dried. Richard picked up the documents, inspecting the signatures with a satisfied gleam in his eye. He folded the papers, tucking them securely back into his tuxedo jacket. He reached out and patted my cheek, a hollow paternal gesture devoid of any genuine warmth. "I always knew you would do the right thing for the family, Aurora," he murmured. "You were always a sensible girl when push came to shove. The money will be in your account by noon. Now go home." Richard and Julian turned, leaving the quiet coat room to rejoin the glittering celebration in the ballroom. They walked away believing they had successfully neutralized the threat. They thought they possessed the legal shielding required to funnel their remaining capital overseas and vanish. I stood alone in the dim room, breathing in the scent of wool and cedar. The trembling in my hands ceased instantly. My slumped shoulders pulled back, locking into a rigid, upright posture. I lifted the silver fountain pen, clicking the hidden mechanism near the top clip. A microscopic green light flashed once before powering down. The device was not a standard writing instrument. It contained a high-definition digital audio transmitter. The microphone hidden within the metal casing was designed to capture whispers in a crowded room. I had just recorded every single word. I captured my father explicitly confessing to the forgery. I captured his admission of utilizing my identity as a buffer for the Cayman lenders. I captured Julian detailing the strategy to redirect liability to protect their assets. The audio file was already encrypting and syncing directly to a secure cloud server monitored by Mitchell Sterling. I dropped the spy pen back into my clutch. I walked out of the coat room, slipping out the side exit of the country club into the freezing winter night. I did not look back at the grand estate. My father now held a signed non-disclosure agreement he believed made him invincible. Armed with that false confidence, he would spend the next 2 days logging into his banking portals, initiating the massive wire transfers required to empty his domestic accounts. He would attempt to move the illicit funds across international borders, walking straight into the federal crosshairs. The bait was taken. The snare was primed, and the United States Attorney was preparing to drop the hammer. The morning after the New Year Eve charity gala, the atmosphere inside the Myers Park estate was thick with the scent of stale cigar smoke and expensive champagne. Richard and Julian were celebrating a victory they believed was etched in stone. My father sat behind his vast mahogany desk, studying the non-disclosure agreement and the trust transfer documents, holding my freshly inked signatures. In his mind, those pieces of paper were a Kevlar shield. They represented the successful amputation of a diseased financial limb. He thought he had severed the cartel debt from his own ledger and strapped the anchor directly to my chest. Operating under this profound delusion of invincibility, Richard initiated the final phase of his escape protocol. He logged into his secured corporate banking portals, bypassing his local wealth managers. He authorized the outbound routing sequences for his remaining clean capital. The destination accounts were scattered across jurisdictions known for strict banking secrecy. He targeted numbered vaults in Switzerland, Cyprus, and the Cayman Islands. He watched the digital loading bars progress across his screen, assuming his wealth was departing American soil. He poured another glass of vintage brut, handing it to Julian. They toasted their perceived brilliance, unaware that their empire was already bleeding out. While my father celebrated his phantom triumph, I sat 3 miles away inside a sterile, windowless conference room on the top floor of the United States Attorney Office. The environment offered a stark, freezing contrast to the country club. The walls were unadorned white cinder block. The table was scratched aluminum. Mitchell Sterling sat to my right, unpacking his leather briefcase. Across the table sat Assistant United States Attorney Marcus Vance. Vance was a meticulous career prosecutor who specialized in unraveling white-collar syndicates. He did not care about affluent pedigrees or custom-tailored suits. He measured truth in forensic data and physical geometry. I slid the sterile blue folder across the cold metal surface. Vance opened the cover, his expression hardening as his eyes scanned the documents. I watched him process the magnitude of the betrayal. He read the decrypted emails detailing the shadow banking ultimatum and the explicit threats of retaliation. He examined the proprietary software traces, exposing the phantom hardware logistics Julian used to defraud his initial investors. Then he reached the physical alibi. He held the sworn affidavit from the federal customs agent alongside the biometric retina scan receipts from the Port of Wilmington. He laid the documents next to a high-resolution copy of the forged commercial loan. The timeline clashed with flawless, undeniable clarity. The geographical impossibility of my father and his narrative was laid bare on the aluminum table. I reached into my black clutch and placed the sleek silver fountain pen on the table. Mitchell handed Vance a secure digital drive containing the extracted audio file. We sat in silence as the prosecutor inserted the drive into his encrypted laptop and pressed play. The crisp, high-definition recording filled the quiet room. The background noise of the gala filtered through the speakers, followed by the unmistakable, arrogant cadence of my father. His voice echoed off the cinder block walls, explicitly confessing to the forgery. He outlined his precise strategy to utilize my identity as a buffer against the offshore creditors. He detailed the outbound escape plan and mocked my impending ruin. Vance stopped the recording. He closed the blue folder, resting his hands flat on top of the cardboard. He did not offer empty promises or theatrical declarations. He reached for his desk phone and dialed a direct extension to a specialized financial crimes task force operating under the Federal Bureau of Investigation. "This is no longer a civil dispute over a forged signature," Vance stated, looking directly at me, his tone vibrating with lethal federal authority. "This is a coordinated conspiracy encompassing wire fraud, identity theft, and international money laundering. Your family is actively attempting to move illicit capital across sovereign borders to evade a criminal syndicate. We are stepping in." The federal government possesses a unique mechanism designed specifically for this exact scenario. The Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act allows prosecutors to bypass standard bureaucratic delays when dismantling organized financial crime. Vance did not need to schedule a hearing or wait for a local judge to sign a preliminary discovery order. He initiated an automated, preemptive strike. Deep within the digital architecture of the global banking system, an invisible net deployed. Richard had initiated his offshore transfers that morning, but international wires do not process instantaneously. They travel through a series of automated clearinghouses. As the millions of dollars stolen from investors and funneled through the real estate shell companies attempted to cross the digital border, the federal algorithms intercepted the routing numbers. The transactions halted mid-flight. The funds did not bounce back to my father, and they did not reach the untraceable vaults in Cyprus. They froze in the digital ether seized by the Department of Justice. The accounts were locked with a federal hold that no high-priced corporate lawyer could penetrate. Richard and Julian remained in their sprawling estate, entirely oblivious to the fact that their escape route had just been incinerated. They thought they were rich men preparing for a comfortable, luxurious exile. In reality, they were penniless suspects locked inside a gilded cage. But the trap required one final component to snap shut permanently. The federal prosecutors needed Richard to swear to his lies on the official public record. They needed him to present the forged documents and the extorted non-disclosure agreement to a judge, cementing his perjury and solidifying the extortion charges. My father, driven by his insatiable need for total dominance, provided the perfect opportunity. He was not satisfied with a simple signature scribbled in a dark coat room. He wanted the liability transfer codified by the highest authority available. He wanted the estate dispute buried forever, ensuring I could never challenge his ownership of the holding company or unravel his financial maneuvers. 2 days after the gala, Mitchell Sterling received a formal digital summons. Richard had instructed his elite corporate defense attorney to file an expedited motion in federal court. The filing requested a binding judicial order to validate the trust transfer and formalize my status as the sole guarantor of the syndicate loan. He submitted the non-disclosure agreement I signed at the country club as proof of my willing participation. He argued that the matter required federal jurisdiction due to the interstate nature of the commercial debt. Richard believed he was orchestrating the final stroke of my destruction. He thought walking into a federal courthouse with his expensive lawyers would legitimize his crimes, insulate him from the offshore creditors, and leave me to shoulder the ruin. He assumed the magistrate would glance at the signatures, stamp the paperwork, and dismiss the case, leaving him free to board a private flight. He failed to realize that the federal magistrate presiding over the docket was already coordinating with Marcus Vance. The judge had already reviewed the biometric port logs, the coastal affidavits, and the devastating audio confession. My father was not scheduling a routine civil validation. He was reserving a front row seat for his own public execution. The stage was set. The invisible audience was waiting. We were heading to court. The imposing granite architecture of the federal courthouse offered a freezing, stark contrast to the sweltering psychological warfare my family had waged over the past month. The structure possessed a rigid, unyielding geometry designed to project the inescapable weight of the United States justice system. Passing through the rigorous security checkpoints and walking down the wide, echoing corridors left no room for country club posturing or socialite gossip. The air inside the building was filtered, sterile, and cold. It smelled of polished stone and old paper. I sat at the heavy oak plaintiff table beside Mitchell Sterling. My posture was straight, my hands folded neatly, resting over the pristine blue folder. I did not feel the erratic pulse of a targeted scapegoat. I felt the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of a compliance auditor preparing to present a finalized, flawless ledger. The heavy double doors at the back of the gallery swung open. The metallic click of the latch echoed through the quiet room, signaling the arrival of the opposition. Richard, Vanessa, and Julian strode down the center aisle. They moved with a synchronized, practiced swagger, projecting the impenetrable aura of Charlotte elite. They wore their wealth like armor. Richard was dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly styled. Julian trailed slightly behind, wearing a sharp navy blazer, checking the time on a heavy gold luxury watch. Vanessa peeled off from the men, taking a seat in the first row of the public gallery. She smoothed the skirt of her designer dress and offered me a tight, artificial smile. It was a look of rehearsed pity, designed to communicate her perceived victory. They were flanked by their lead defense counsel, Gregory Pierce. Pierce was a senior partner at a top-tier regional law firm. He built his lucrative career serving as a high-priced fixer for wealthy developers accustomed to bullying local elected judges into quiet settlements. He carried a monogrammed leather portfolio and wore the relaxed, confident expression of a man who believed he was walking into a 5-minute rubber stamp proceeding. They took their seats at the defense table, exchanging smug, victorious glances. Richard unbuttoned his suit jacket, leaning back in the heavy wooden chair. He looked across the aisle at me, offering a slow, patronizing nod. He operated under the profound delusion that the non-disclosure agreement I signed in the dark coat room of the country club was a definitive surrender. He expected me to keep my head bowed, stare at the floor, and silently accept a future of personal bankruptcy, while he finalized his escape to an offshore sanctuary. A side door opened, and the court bailiff commanded the room to rise. Judge Elias Thornton emerged from his private chambers, taking his seat at the elevated mahogany bench. Judge Thornton was a veteran magistrate holding a lifetime appointment. Before donning the black robe, he spent 2 decades working as a relentless federal prosecutor, dismantling complex corporate racketeering syndicates. He possessed a renowned, unyielding hatred for white-collar criminals who utilized complex paperwork to mask their theft. He adjusted his reading glasses, looking down at the preliminary filings. He did not offer a polite greeting. He did not smile. His expression was a mask of cold judicial scrutiny. Counsel Judge Thornton stated, his voice carrying a resonant, commanding authority. "We are here to review a motion for expedited civil validation regarding a disputed estate trust and an associated commercial liability transfer. Who is speaking for the defense?" Gregory Pierce stood up, buttoning his jacket and stepping smoothly toward the podium. He projected a booming, practiced cadence, honed over years of dominating state-level civil courts. He believed the narrative he was about to present was an airtight family settlement. Your Honor, Pierce began opening his leather portfolio. "We are here today to formalize an amicable and voluntary resolution to a regrettable family dispute. My client, Richard Harris, is the patriarch of a prominent local enterprise. He has generously agreed to step in and manage a complex financial burden currently overwhelming his daughter." Pierce paced slowly, letting his words echo off the high ceilings. "The plaintiff, Aurora Harris, has found herself entangled in a severe commercial debt regarding a short-term bridge loan. To prevent her from facing a catastrophic default, my client has negotiated a structured transfer. We ask the court to officially validate the immediate transfer of the $500,000 inheritance trust, specifically the equity stake in Apex Holding Partners, into my client name. In exchange, the plaintiff has agreed to retain sole status as the guarantor of the commercial debt, thus isolating the core family assets from external collection agencies." The defense attorney paused, reaching into his portfolio to extract a thick stack of documents. To demonstrate the voluntary nature of this arrangement, we submit the signed non-disclosure and liability transfer agreements executed by the plaintiff just 3 days ago, Pierce concluded, signaling the bailiff. These documents bear her verified signature. We request the court enter these into the public record and issue a binding order finalizing the transfer. This will allow the Harris family to move forward and heal privately. The bailiff took the paperwork, carrying it up the short wooden stairs to the elevated bench. Richard watched the exchange with a gleam of predatory triumph in his eyes. He believed he had just achieved the ultimate deception. He thought he was using a federal judge to launder his crimes and legally chain me to the Cayman Island syndicate. Julian leaned back, crossing his arms, a relieved smirk spreading across his face. Judge Thornton picked up the documents. He flipped through the pages, examining the signatures. The silence in the courtroom stretched out, creating a heavy, suffocating tension. The magistrate did not nod in agreement. He did not reach for his wooden gavel to finalize the order. He placed the paperwork flat on his desk, folding his hands over the files. He looked over the rim of his glasses, piercing the defense attorney with a look of pure, unadulterated ice. "Does counsel for the plaintiff have a response to this motion?" Judge Thornton asked, turning his gaze toward our table. Mitchell Sterling stood up. He did not smooth his tie or clear his throat. He did not approach the podium to engage in standard, polite, civil debate. The veteran litigator remained standing at our table, projecting a coiled, lethal focus. He bypassed all standard courtroom pleasantries, stepping directly into the line of fire. "Your Honor," Mitchell's voice boomed, shattering the quiet atmosphere of the room. "We vehemently oppose the motion. We ask the court to reject the submitted documents in their entirety." Gregory Pierce frowned, turning around to glare at Mitchell. The defense attorney expected a minor dispute over the specific terms of the non-disclosure agreement. He assumed we were going to beg for a slight reduction in the debt liability. "The defense is not seeking a civil transfer," Mitchell continued, his tone dropping into a chilling, unforgiving register. "They are not attempting to formalize a generous family settlement to protect my client." Mitchell rested his hand on the sterile blue folder lying on our table. They are utilizing this federal courtroom to finalize an international wire fraud conspiracy launder syndicate capital and execute massive identity theft against my client. Mitchell declared the words, striking the defense table, like physical blows. The documents opposing counsel just handed to the bench are the instruments of a felony extortion scheme designed to shield a localized Ponzi operation. The courtroom went dead silent. The ambient hum of the ventilation system seemed to vanish. In the gallery, Vanessa let out a short, strangled gasp. Richard gripped the edge of the defense table, the color draining instantly from his face. The smug, relaxed posture of the Harris family shattered, evaporating into the cold, sterile air. Gregory Pierce stood frozen at the podium, his mouth slightly open. He was a seasoned attorney, but he suddenly realized a terrifying professional truth. He had not walked into a routine civil hearing. He had just presented forged documents to a federal magistrate, placing his own law license and his freedom in direct jeopardy. The defense attorney turned back to the judge, preparing to demand proof, to shout an objection, and protect his firm from the radioactive allegations. But Mitchell Sterling was already unfastening the clasps of the blue folder, preparing to unleash the prosecutorial arsenal that would ensure my father and brother never saw the outside of a prison wall again. Mitchell Sterling did not grant the opposition a single second to recover their equilibrium. Before the defense counsel could formulate an objection or request a recess, the veteran litigator opened the sterile blue folder resting on our table. He withdrew a thick stack of printed documents and handed the copies to the court clerk, who carried them up to the mahogany bench. We submit Plaintiff Exhibit A through C into the official record, Mitchell announced, his voice carrying a crisp, unyielding cadence. These documents contain the verified cellular global positioning coordinates, time-stamped biometric retina scans, and a sworn affidavit from a United States customs agent. Judge Thornton adjusted his reading glasses, picking up the top sheet. The quiet hum of the courtroom ventilation system seemed to amplify in the tense silence. The defense claims my client signed a commercial bridge loan on a specific Thursday afternoon in a downtown Charlotte boardroom. Mitchell continued pacing a few slow steps toward the center aisle. The biometric logs and the federal affidavit prove undeniably that Aurora Harris was conducting a maritime security inspection at the Port of Wilmington, over 200 miles away, at that exact minute. The signature on the commercial loan is a textbook forgery, orchestrated by Richard Harris to shift a catastrophic cartel debt onto his daughter. Gregory Pierce, the high-priced defense attorney, picked up his copy of the evidence from the defense table. He was a man who built his lucrative career protecting legitimate businesses from regulatory fines. He navigated civil disputes and negotiated quiet settlements. He did not traffic in federal forgery or shadow banking syndicates. As his eyes scanned the sworn federal affidavit, the blood drained entirely from his face, leaving a sickly, pale hue. Pierce understood the fatal jeopardy of his current position. By submitting the fabricated non-disclosure agreement and the forged loan documents to the magistrate just moments prior, he had unknowingly presented falsified evidence to a federal court. He had crossed a perilous ethical line drawn by his own clients. The defense attorney slowly lowered the papers to the desk. He took a deliberate physical step away from Richard, putting tangible distance between himself and the radioactive epicenter of the defense table. But Mitchell was not finished dismantling the illusion. He reached into his suit pocket and produced a small, secure digital drive. To demonstrate the premeditated nature of this extortion, Mitchell stated, turning his gaze toward the judge, "We submit an audio recording captured during the New Year's Eve charity gala hosted by the defendants." The court clerk received the drive, plugging it into the digital terminal at the bench. A moment later, the high-definition audio filled the cavernous room. The initial sound of distant string music and clinking champagne glasses filtered through the speakers, followed by the unmistakable echo of a quiet coat room. Then, the arrogant voice of my father, rang out. Sign the lines at the bottom of the recorded version of Richard instructed, his condescending tone immortalized on the permanent record. You absorb the loan, you drop the estate claim, and you keep your mouth shut. I needed a buffer to satisfy the Cayman lenders while I organize our outbound transfers. You were the only available asset. The audio cut off, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. In the first row of the public gallery, Vanessa slumped forward, covering her mouth with trembling hands. Her flawless socialite persona fractured into 1,000 jagged pieces. She could not spin a country club rumor to erase the sound of her husband confessing to an international crime in a federal courthouse. Richard sat paralyzed. The polished real estate developer who viewed people as disposable chess pieces realized his favored tactics held no power here. He had spent his life building paper shields, assuming his wealth and influence could deflect any consequence. He underestimated the meticulous discipline of a compliance auditor. We do not argue with emotion. We track every microscopic grain of data until the ledger balances. Judge Thornton stared down at the defense table. The magistrate possessed the cold, evaluating gaze of a predator who had just cornered his prey. Yet the undeniable proof of forgery and extortion merely served as the opening act. Mitchell walked back to the plaintiff table, picking up the heavy-bound portfolio containing my grandfather and his master estate plans. Your Honor, Mitchell said, holding the leather-bound file aloft, the defense assumes they are fighting to acquire a liquid cash account. They believe the $500,000 trust left by Hal Harris is a simple repository of funds they can utilize to flee their creditors. They are profoundly mistaken. Mitchell unfastened the brass latch, opening the portfolio to the primary addendum. The $500,000 figure is a static tax valuation assessed over a decade ago, Mitchell explained, projecting his voice so every word landed with devastating clarity. The actual asset enclosed within the trust is a controlling 51% equity stake in Apex Holding Partners. This is the precise corporate entity Richard Harris currently utilizes to launder illicit capital for an offshore shadow syndicate. Richard flinched as if struck by an invisible force. His breathing turned shallow and erratic. My grandfather Hal knew his son harbored a dangerous hunger for unearned prestige. Hal anticipated that Richard would eventually leverage the family foundation to fund his corrupt ambitions. He embedded a structural contingency plan to ensure the corporate infrastructure could be saved. By forging his daughter's signature to absorb a cartel loan and attempting to extort the specific trust, Mitchell declared Richard Harris triggered the irrevocable penalty embedded within the estate documents. The trust dictates that any fraudulent action or coercion directed against the primary beneficiary instantly strips the acting executor of his minority rights and all executive privilege. Mitchell turned to look directly at my father, delivering the ultimate kill shot. Richard Harris did not just fail to steal the money. By executing this extortion, he unknowingly authorized the irrevocable seizure of his own corporate infrastructure. He legally handed Aurora Harris the keys to his entire empire. The sheer gravity of the plot twist settled over the courtroom like a falling vault door. My father stared at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying, dawning comprehension. The realization carved hollow lines into his face. He had built a sprawling money laundering machine to hide Julian and his phantom tech startup. He had funneled millions of dollars through Apex Holding Partners to scrub the dirty capital. He needed my signature to secure his escape. Instead, his arrogance activated the poison pill. Because I now owned undisputed total control of the holding company, I possessed the supreme executive authority to waive all corporate privilege. I held the legal right to open the illicit books and hand the unredacted ledgers directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Richard had constructed the gallows, woven the rope, and placed the lever directly into my hands. Judge Thornton leaned forward, resting his forearms on the elevated mahogany desk. He looked at my father with lethal, uncompromising authority. The polished illusion of the Charlotte elite was disintegrating on the permanent public record. The invincibility they projected at country club luncheons and charity galas burned away, leaving only the raw, undeniable facts of their crimes. Richard was trapped. The paper shield was gone. The offshore syndicate was waiting for their money, and the federal prosecutors were waiting with an indictment. But the collapse of the patriarch was only half of the equation. The illicit loans, the Ponzi scheme, and the phantom hardware all traced back to the Golden Boy. I turned my attention away from my father and looked at the empty chair beside him. Julian was sitting there listening to the meticulous destruction of his endless safety net. The brother who had never endured a single hardship, who mocked me from his luxury penthouse, now faced a reality he could not charm his way out of. The federal prison doors were opening, and the syndicate enforcers were circling. The pressure in the room shifted, finding a new fragile target, preparing to fracture the family lineage beyond all recognition. The reverberation of Mitchell Sterling closing the leather-bound portfolio signaled the end of the defensive line. The protective perimeter my father spent decades constructing evaporated, leaving the defense table entirely exposed to the searing heat of federal scrutiny. Judge Elias Thornton did not strike his wooden gavel to restore order. He allowed the heavy silence to stretch, ensuring the magnitude of the revelation sank into the marrow of the defendants. The magistrate possessed a reputation for dismantling organized racketeering syndicates. He understood the structural hierarchy of complex fraud operations. A scheme involving forged commercial bridge loans, phantom hardware manifests, and offshore shadow capital requires a collaborative effort. Richard provided the laundering mechanism through Apex holding partners, but the original illicit debt, the central engine of the Ponzi structure, rested squarely on the shoulders of the tech startup. Judge Thornton shifted his focus. His cold, evaluating gaze bypassed my paralyzed father and locked onto the man sitting at the far end of the table. Julian shifted uncomfortably under the intense judicial spotlight. The sharp navy blazer and heavy gold luxury watch no longer projected the aura of a successful venture capitalist. They looked like cheap props clinging to a terrified child. "Mr. Harris," Judge Thornton stated, his tone dropping into a low, resonant register that carried to the back of the gallery. "This court has just received sworn evidence demonstrating an active conspiracy to commit interstate wire fraud and identity theft. The forged loan documentation directly benefits your corporate entity. Given the international routing destinations uncovered in the plaintiff exhibits, you are currently staring down the barrel of decades in a federal penitentiary." The color drained from Julian's face. He swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly above his crisp collar. "Do you wish to clarify your involvement in the origination of these fraudulent loans?" Judge Thornton asked, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the mahogany bench. "Or shall we simply forward the unredacted ledgers to the United States Attorney Office without your perspective?" Gregory Pierce, the high-priced defense attorney, snapped out of his stunned paralysis. He recognized the lethal trap the magistrate was setting. A judge asking a defendant to clarify involvement during a motion hearing involving explosive new evidence is not an invitation for a casual conversation. It is a demand for a confession. Pierce reached across the table, grabbing Julian by the forearm, his fingers digging into the fabric of the blazer. "Do not answer that question," Pierce hissed in a harsh whisper, clearly audible across the silent aisle. "Keep your mouth shut. You invoke your Fifth Amendment rights immediately. We need to request a recess and evaluate the criminal exposure." A disciplined corporate executive facing a federal inquiry understands the value of silence. They absorb the initial shock, maintain a unified defensive front, and let their legal counsel navigate the procedural wreckage. But Julian Harris was not a disciplined executive. He was a spoiled, arrogant golden boy. For 31 years, his parents shielded him from the natural consequences of his actions. When he failed out of prestigious boarding schools, Richard wrote generous checks to secure his admission elsewhere. When he crashed exotic leased cars, Vanessa bullied the local police chiefs into dropping the charges. They built a towering fortress of unearned privilege around him, cultivating a fragile, inflated ego. They crippled his ability to endure genuine adversity. When a man raised in a padded room is suddenly thrust into a frozen environment, he does not fight the elements. He breaks. The looming reality of a federal holding cell, the prospect of trading his luxury penthouse for a concrete slab, shattered Julian's psyche instantly. The fragile loyalty binding the Harris family did not stem from unconditional love. It was a transactional arrangement based entirely on comfort and self-preservation. The moment that comfort evaporated, the loyalty dissolved into dust. Julian ripped his arm away from the defense attorney with a violent, frantic jerk. "I did not forge her name," Julian screamed, his voice cracking, hitting a shrill, hysterical pitch that echoed off the high granite ceilings. He scrambled backward, pushing his heavy wooden chair away from the table. The chair tipped over, clattering loudly against the polished floor. He stumbled, putting physical distance between himself and the man who had funded his entire existence. Julian raised a trembling hand and pointed his index finger directly at Richard. "He did it!" Julian cried out, the panic bleeding into every syllable. "My dad orchestrated the whole thing. He kept Aurora and her old banking records in his safe. He used her Social Security number to draft the guarantees. I did not know how to run the holding companies. He set up the shell limited liability corporations to hide the money and pay off the syndicate. I just signed the paperwork he put in front of me. I am innocent. He made me do it to protect the real estate firm." The courtroom erupted into a chaotic symphony of shocked gasps and furiously scribbling court reporters. In less than 10 seconds, the Golden Boy completely cannibalized his own father. He traded the man who had drained his wealth to protect him for the desperate, pathetic hope of a lighter criminal sentence. He confessed to his involvement while shifting the entire burden of the forgery and the money laundering directly onto Richard. He provided the federal prosecutors with a pristine, sworn witness statement detailing the internal mechanics of the conspiracy. From the front row of the public gallery, a wretched, guttural wail pierced the air. Vanessa collapsed forward, pressing her forehead against the polished wooden railing. Her shoulders heaved as she sobbed uncontrollably. The immaculate socialite who had orchestrated the vicious smear campaign against me, who had happily offered me to the offshore wolves, was forced to watch her prized son destroy her husband on the permanent public record. The flawless image of the Harris family she spent decades cultivating burned to ash in front of her eyes. Richard sat absolutely paralyzed. The booming patriarchal authority he wielded at the Christmas Eve dinner was entirely gone. He did not turn to look at his weeping wife. He did not yell at his traitorous son. He stared straight ahead, utterly destroyed by the realization that his empire was seized, his escape route was blocked, and his favorite child was the one tightening the noose. The family had eaten each other alive in less than 3 minutes. Judge Thornton picked up his wooden gavel, striking the sounding block with a series of sharp, cracking blows. The noise cut through the chaotic murmurs demanding immediate order. Armed court bailiffs moved swiftly down the side aisles, positioning themselves near the defense table to prevent any further outbursts or physical altercations. Gregory Pierce frantically gathered his legal pads, stuffing them into his monogrammed portfolio. He was a civil litigator who suddenly found himself standing in the epicenter of a sprawling federal crime scene. He looked desperate to escape the radioactive fallout generated by his own clients. I remained seated at the plaintiff table watching the implosion with a cold, clinical detachment. I did not feel a sudden surge of joyous celebration or a lingering ache of sorrow. The emotional ties binding me to the people across the aisle had severed completely during the winter storm. I felt the steady, quiet satisfaction of an auditor watching a corrupted ledger finally balance. The deficit was accounted for, and the fraudulent entries were exposed. The civil phase of my retaliation was officially complete. The poison pill clause ensured the holding company and the core family assets reverted to my control. But the explosive confessions triggered an entirely different mechanism. The federal machinery was awake, and the final disposition of the Harris family was no longer a matter of civil dispute. It was a matter of criminal indictment. The judge was preparing to issue the ruling that would fundamentally reshape the trajectory of our lives. The wooden gavel struck the sounding block with a sharp, definitive crack. The noise sliced through the residual chaos of Julian and his frantic confession echoing across the granite walls of the federal courtroom. Judge Elias Thornton did not raise his voice to quiet the lingering murmurs. He simply let the heavy, authoritative sound dictate the conclusion of the proceedings. I am referring to Richard Harris and Julian Harris to the United States Attorney Office for immediate criminal indictment. Judge Thornton declared his tone devoid of any judicial leniency. The charges will encompass interstate wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to launder illicit capital. Given the established ties to unregulated offshore entities and the explicit flight risk demonstrated by the intent to funnel assets overseas, bail is denied. The magistrate nodded to the perimeter of the room. Take the defendants into custody. 2 armed United States Marshals stepped forward from the shadows of the side aisles. They moved with swift, practiced efficiency, bypassing the polished wooden gate separating the gallery from the defense table. They did not offer polite requests or allow the men to gather their belongings. The first marshal grasped Richard by the shoulder, pulling him upright. My father did not resist. The arrogant real estate developer who had spent his life dictating terms to everyone around him was reduced to a hollow shell. He offered no final threatening glare in my direction. He stared blankly at the floor, his posture sagging as the marshal pulled his arms behind his back. The metallic ratcheting sound of the steel handcuffs locking around his wrists sounded like the closing of a heavy vault door. The second marshal approached Julian. My brother offered a brief, pathetic struggle, weeping openly as the officer secured his hands. He looked toward the gallery, searching for the mother who had always shielded him from the consequences of his actions. But Vanessa could offer no salvation. She remained slumped against the wooden railing, her pristine socialite facade ruined by smeared makeup and raw, unvarnished terror. The marshals marched my father and brother down the center aisle, guiding them toward the secure holding cells situated deep within the courthouse. The heavy double doors swung shut, sealing them away from the opulent world they had manipulated for decades. Judge Thornton turned his attention back to the initial civil filing resting on his mahogany bench. Regarding the emergency motion for expedited civil validation, Judge Thornton stated, picking up his pen, the court finds the submitted non-disclosure agreement and the commercial loan guarantee to be products of severe fraudulent extortion. Those documents are hereby nullified and stricken from the record. Furthermore, the court recognizes the execution of the protective contingency clause embedded within the Hal Harris master estate. The magistrate signed his name across the bottom of the ruling. The 51% equity stake in Apex Holding Partners and all underlying assets derived from that entity are legally transferred to the plaintiff, Aurora Harris. The civil matter is resolved. We are adjourned. The gavel fell one last time. The invisible chains my family had attempted to wrap around my neck shattered into dust. Mitchell Sterling packed his leather briefcase, snapping the brass latches shut. He offered a firm, quiet nod of respect. We stood up and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Vanessa sitting alone in the gallery, surrounded by the wreckage of her empire. The execution of the civil order moved with breathtaking speed. Apex Holding Partners was not merely a shell company for laundering shadow capital. It was the central vascular system of my father and his commercial real estate portfolio. By legally securing the controlling stake, I acquired the deeds, the holding accounts, and the physical properties tied to his name. The crown jewel of those assets was the sprawling Myers Park estate. I issued a strict, uncompromising eviction notice the following morning. 14 days later, the reality of the court order materialized on the cobblestone driveway of the property I used to call home. I parked my reliable sedan across the street, rolling down the window to observe the logistical dismantling of a high society life. The asset freezes initiated by the federal prosecutors meant Vanessa lacked the liquid cash to hire a premium moving company. She could not afford the white glove services that packed fine china into padded crates. Instead, a rented moving truck sat idling near the front pillars. I watched my mother carry heavy-duty black trash bags out the front door. The bags bulged with her designer dresses, cashmere sweaters, and imported silk scarves. She dragged them across the bluestone porch, her shoulders aching under the physical labor she had avoided her entire adult life. She loaded the plastic bags into the back of the rusted truck, stripping away the final remnants of her unearned prestige. When the truck finally pulled away, it did not head toward another gated community. Vanessa relocated to a cramped, outdated apartment complex situated near the intersection of Interstate 85. Her new environment offered a jarring sensory shift. The quiet rustle of ancient oak trees and the scent of catered lamb were replaced by the deafening roar of commercial semi-trucks and the heavy smell of diesel exhaust. She sat in that tiny, noisy unit, waiting for a federal sentencing hearing that would keep her husband incarcerated for the rest of his natural life. I waited until the taillights of her rented truck disappeared down the street. I shifted my sedan into drive and steered up the winding cobblestone path. I stepped out into the crisp winter air and walked up the front steps. I retrieved the new set of brass keys the estate lawyers had provided. I slid the key into the lock, turning the cylinder with a satisfying, heavy click. I pushed the oak door open and stepped into the grand foyer. The house was empty. The silence inside the vast architecture felt clean and purified. I walked past the spot where my father shattered his espresso mug on the Persian rug. I continued down the main hallway, pushing open the double doors leading into the grand ballroom. This was the exact room where Richard had tapped his crystal champagne flute. This was the space where he attempted to extort my future in front of 60 affluent peers, assuming I would drown under the weight of his institutional pressure. I stood in the center of the expansive floor, envisioning the necessary structural changes. I did not intend to live in a monument built by an arrogant developer. I intended to work in a fortress built by a compliance auditor. The following Monday, a commercial contracting crew arrived at my direction. I stood in the foyer, pointing to the opulent fixtures that defined the Harris family illusion. "Tear it all down," I instructed the foreman. Over the next month, the contractors stripped the ballroom to its foundational bones. They removed the heavy velvet drapes that blocked the natural sunlight. They dismantled the gaudy crystal chandeliers, packing the fragile glass into crates to be liquidated at auction. They rolled up the antique rugs, exposing the pristine hardwood underneath. In their place, I installed the architecture of accountability. Sleek, minimalist workstations replaced the antique dining tables. Floor-to-ceiling frosted glass panels divided the cavernous room into functional collaborative pods. High-capacity encrypted server racks humming with quiet cooling fans occupied the corners where classical string quartets used to play. I did not return to my old logistics firm. The risk-averse regional director who suspended my salary based on country club rumors sent me a frantic, apologetic email begging for my return. I deleted the message without replying. I launched my own independent logistics auditing firm, operating directly out of the gutted ballroom. My specialized proprietary software, the same code Julian attempted to steal to build his fraudulent empire, became the foundational service of my new enterprise. Word traveled quickly through the corporate sectors of Charlotte. Executives learned about the compliance officer who utilized federal maritime logs to dismantle a shadow banking syndicate and incarcerate her own corrupt bloodline. They realized I possessed an uncompromising standard of integrity that could not be bribed, intimidated, or extorted. Lucrative contracts from major shipping conglomerates began flooding my inbox. My new firm expanded rapidly, requiring me to hire a dedicated team of junior analysts to manage the incoming workload. I sat at my wide mahogany desk, positioned near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the quiet, sprawling grounds of the Myers Park estate. The winter frost had yielded to the early signs of a Carolina spring. The afternoon sun warmed the glass, casting bright geometric patterns across the hardwood floor. I poured a cup of dark roast coffee, resting the ceramic mug near my dual monitors. The screens displayed real-time maritime shipping manifests, tracking the steady, legitimate flow of global commerce. I thought about the freezing December night when I walked out of this very house, carrying nothing but my coat and a single word of defiance. My family had demanded my safety net. They tossed me into the deep end of a criminal conspiracy, hoping the cartel debt and the federal forgery would drag me under the surface. They assumed I would panic thrash in the water and eventually sink to save them. Instead, I let them drown under the terrifying weight of their own greed. I used their arrogance as an anchor, wrapping their fabricated ledgers around their ankles and watching them plunge into the abyss. I took a slow sip of the dark coffee, looking out over the manicured lawns I now owned. The numbers were verified. The deficits were resolved. The structural integrity of my life was finally secure. The ledger was permanently balanced. Drive through any prosperous neighborhood in the American South past the towering ancient oaks, the wrought iron gates, and the sprawling manicured lawns, and you will see gleaming monuments to success. These estates project an aura of unshakable security, standing as physical testaments to the modern pursuit of prosperity. Yet a house constructed on a hollow foundation will always crumble, regardless of how exquisite the brickwork appears from the street. The story of the Harris family, of Julian's spectacular fall and Aurora's quiet, unyielding triumph, transcends the boundaries of a simple legal thriller. It serves as a stark spiritual mirror held up to modern domestic life. It asks us to examine the hidden rot that takes root when we prioritize the illusion of prestige over the heavy, unglamorous work of building human character. In our current culture, the concept of the American dream frequently warps into an endless, exhausting performance. Success is too often measured by visible metrics: the prestigious zip code, the luxury vehicle, the flawless holiday card. Parents feeling the crushing weight of societal expectations can easily internalize this pressure. They begin to view their household not as a sanctuary for growth, but as a public relations firm. Richard and Vanessa represent a specific, pervasive tragedy born from this mindset. They fell into the insidious trap of ego-driven parenting. To them, children were not independent souls requiring guidance, patience, and boundaries. Their children were polished accessories. Julian, with his charismatic smile and flashy tech pitches, provided a convenient reflection of their own perceived elite status. He was a trophy they paraded before their country club peers to validate their worth. But true parental love is not a shield against reality. When a mother and father consistently rescue a child from the natural repercussions of their choices, they commit a profound disservice. Writing checks to erase debts, utilizing influence to silence critics, and bullying anyone who demands accountability, these actions do not demonstrate devotion. They demonstrate fear. By paving over every stumbling block in Julian's path, his parents robbed him of the essential friction required to develop a moral compass. They created an adult who believed the laws of consequence did not apply to him. Julian never learned how to fall. Because his parents built a padded room around his fragility, his eventual collision with the real world brought down their entire lineage. Contrast this tragic enablement with the burden placed upon Aurora. She was the child who possessed the quiet grit required to navigate complex ledgers, trace missing cargo, and earn an honest living. Yet her steady labor did not serve her parents' vanity. Her success was not loud enough for a charity gala toast. Because she did not feed their egos, they rendered her invisible. The deepest spiritual error a parent can make is viewing a child as a disposable asset. When Richard and Vanessa decided to weaponize Aurora's future to cover Julian's crimes, they revealed the darkest side of conditional love. They expected her to act as a human shield, assuming her ingrained sense of duty would force her to shoulder a crushing burden. They measured her worth solely by her utility in a crisis. This toxic dynamic pits siblings against one another, destroying the natural sacred bond they should share. Favoritism acts as a slow poison, breeding resentment in the neglected child and a fatal entitlement in the favored one. A grounded, healthy family structure relies on a vastly different currency. It requires unwavering fairness, deep emotional awareness, and a commitment to honesty that supersedes public perception. True family responsibility means having the courage to let your children face the wind. It involves standing steadfastly beside them while they navigate the rocky soil of accountability, rather than hiring lawyers to hide their footprints. If we wish to raise resilient individuals in a fast-paced, image-obsessed era, we must actively celebrate the quiet virtues within our own homes. We must teach our sons and daughters that the cleanliness of their conscience holds infinitely more value than the balance of their bank accounts. The sweat of honest labor purifies the spirit, forging a foundation of self-reliance that no offshore bank or corrupt official can ever steal. Integrity is not inherited through a bloodline, nor is it transferred in a trust fund. It is forged in the quiet, unseen moments when a person chooses to do what is right, even when the cost of truth feels unbearable. Aurora's ultimate victory was not simply financial. When she tore down the opulent crystal chandeliers in her parents' former ballroom and replaced them with the sleek architecture of her auditing firm, she was dismantling a generational curse. She broke the cycle of deception by refusing to participate in the illusion. She recognized that true loyalty does not demand you drown alongside a sinking ship to prove your devotion. We share these narratives not to cast judgment from a safe, comfortable distance, but to awaken the dormant wisdom we all carry inside. The struggles depicted in these stories reflect the very real battles fought behind closed doors in neighborhoods across the country. If you recognize a piece of your own journey in Aurora's unyielding resilience, or if you have ever felt like the invisible pillar holding up a fragile ceiling for people who refuse to see your worth, you are not alone. I invite you to join our growing community of listeners who value truth over theatricality. Please subscribe to Sister Revenge, leave a comment sharing your own experiences with setting boundaries, and hit the like button. Together, we can continue to explore the hidden landscapes of human nature, learning to build lives rooted in genuine authenticity rather than exhausting illusion. As the dust settles on the Myers Park estate, the grand ballroom no longer echoes with the shallow laughter of superficial gatherings. It hums with the steady, reassuring rhythm of honest work. The story of the Harris family leaves us with a lingering, uncomfortable thought to carry into the night. When the bank accounts drain, when the neighborhood gossip fades, and when the pristine social armor inevitably cracks, what truly remains? If the universe stripped away your titles, your wealth, and the flawless image you project to the world, tomorrow morning, who would be standing in the dim light? And when you look closely at the family you have built, the values you have instilled, and the truths you defend, are you looking at a sanctuary of enduring strength, or just a beautiful, fragile mirror waiting to shatter?